The Okavango Delta had dried to a whisper. Dust curled above cracked soil where water used to dance. Once lush channels had become empty corridors. The reeds brittle, the air tight with heat. Birds flew farther each morning in search of fish. The great herds that once painted the horizon in motion had thinned. Drawn away by thirst, Marco Leone adjusted the brim of his sun-faded hat and lifted his binoculars. A lone elephant moved slowly along the riverbed, its shadow long and warped by the late afternoon sun. No lions today, not yet. He lowered the binoculars and scanned the silence. Marco had been living in the reserve for nearly 8 months. Sent by a European Wildlife Foundation. He was tasked with observing predator behavior in extreme weather cycles. This year had been brutal. 6 months without real rain. The delta, usually alive with green and shimmer, now felt like a skeleton of its former self. He climbed back into the old Land Rover, engine coughing into life, and drove upriver. The trail narrowed between thorn bushes and skeleton trees. Every few kilometers he would stop, scan the horizon, mark any signs of movement. Then he heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been there. Not out here, not so faint, not so alone. A cub's roar. It came again, a broken, ragged cry. Not a warning, not a challenge. A plea. Marco cut the engine. He grabbed his water bottle and stepped out carefully, boots crunching over the cracked clay. The sound came from behind a tangle of mopane trees. He moved slowly, instinctively lowering his stance, careful not to trigger panic or aggression. And then he saw it. A lion cub, no older than 4 months. Its coat matted with dust. Ribs showing, left front leg bent unnaturally beneath it. The cub tried to stand as Marco approached, but collapsed almost immediately, a soft growl slipping from its throat. No mother, no siblings, no pride in sight. Marco stopped 10 feet away. His heart beat like a drum. He knew the rules. Observers don't intervene. Nature is cruel, and every rescue ripples through the balance. But standing there, watching the cub struggle to lift its head, something inside him shifted. This wasn't a lesson in detachment. It was a moment of choice. "I shouldn't do this," he whispered. But he did. He pulled a cloth from his backpack, soaked it with water, and moved closer. The cub didn't snarl. It didn't run. It simply looked at him, eyes wide, pupils dilated, breath shallow. That look anchored Marco to the earth. Not wild fear, not confusion, hope. He knelt down, moving slowly, letting the cub sniff his hand before gently touching its side. The leg was badly sprained. Maybe fractured. No open wound. The real danger was dehydration. Marco reached into his bag and pulled out a collapsible bowl. He poured in a small amount of water and slid it forward. The cub stared, then leaned, licked, drank. "You're still fighting," Marco murmured. "Good." He bundled the cub in a blanket and carried it to the truck. Heart thudding, eyes scanning constantly for signs of an approaching pride. But none came. The cub was alone. Back at camp, Marco cleared out an unused storage tent and converted it into a recovery shelter. He laid the cub down gently on padded blankets, cleaned the leg, and applied a makeshift splint using bandages and sticks. The cub whimpered only once, then fell quiet. Marco sat beside it as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting the tent in amber light. "I'm going to call you Kanu," he said softly. "It means hope." Over the next few days, Marco broke every rule in the book. He fed Kanu a specialized formula meant for young carnivores. He adjusted the splint daily, cleaned the cub's fur, and sat with him for hours. Slowly, Kanu began to respond. The pain in his eyes dulled. His appetite returned. One morning, Marco found him sitting up, wobbly, but alert, tail twitching in short bursts of curiosity. Every time Marco entered the tent, Kanu's ears would perk up. He'd look up, wait, trust, and Marco, despite everything he'd learned about boundaries in the wild, couldn't help but speak to him like an old friend. "Don't get too used to this," he'd say with a smile. "You're not staying." But neither of them seemed convinced. By the second week, Kanu could limp a few steps. He dragged his injured leg, but he moved with determination. At night, he curled in the blankets, breathing slow and deep. Sometimes Marco would sit outside the tent and listen, one hand resting near the entrance. He knew he'd have to report it eventually. The Foundation would frown on the rescue. Some might demand Kanu be moved to a controlled facility or even euthanized if his leg didn't heal properly. But Marco had made his decision. He wasn't raising a pet. He was giving a wild animal a second chance. And deep down, he knew Kanu's pride hadn't left him out of neglect. They'd moved on to survive. In this brutal season, even lions had to choose. One morning, as Marco refilled the water bowl, Kanu stepped toward him. No limp, no hesitation. Then he rubbed his head softly against Marco's knee before turning away and curling up in the sunlight. Marco froze. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He picked up his field notebook and wrote only one line. "In a land where water fails, hope still grows teeth and walks on four legs." Outside the tent, the first clouds in months gathered faintly at the edge of the sky. The rains were still far off. But something had shifted. Kanu was no longer the abandoned cub. He was the beginning of something. The temporary camp Marco built near the river wasn't much, just a canvas tent. A folding table, a few tools, and a cooking stove that coughed more smoke than heat. But to Marco and Kanu, it was home. Every morning, Marco would rise with the sun, stretch the stiffness from his back, and find Kanu already awake, watching him with curious golden eyes. The cub's leg had healed faster than expected, though a slight stiffness remained. Kanu moved freely now, bounding over rocks, stalking birds with the exaggerated stealth of youth, and pouncing on dry leaves as if they were prey. And yet, no matter how far he wandered, he always came back to Marco. Always. He followed Marco to the river when he went to collect water. He trailed him through the bush during wildlife counts. Always 5 steps behind. He sat beside the campfire at night, tail swishing lazily, ears alert to the crackle of flames and the low hum of Marco's voice. Kanu had become his shadow. At first, Marco resisted the emotional pull. He reminded himself this wasn't forever. Kanu would one day need to return to the wild. To the pride he had been separated from, if they were even still alive. But resisting became harder with every passing day. Especially at night, when Kanu would curl up just outside the tent flap. His body pressed close, like a guard dog with fur and claws and a lion's breath. More often than not, Kanu would wake Marco before dawn by shoving his nose through the tent opening and huffing impatiently. Demanding attention. It was like raising a child. A wild child. Marco even began talking to him more freely. Not just simple commands like, stay, or no. But actual conversation. Kanu never responded with words. Of course. But his eyes always seemed to listen. There was understanding in them. Recognition. Trust that went beyond instinct. One evening, as the heat retreated and the sky turned lavender, Marco was jotting field notes by the fire. Kanu lay beside him, head on his paws. The cub had grown, more muscle in his shoulders. Fuller mane starting to sprout around his neck. No longer a helpless cub. But not quite a full-grown lion either. In between, like a teenager finding his place in the world. Marco paused and looked at him. "You know," he said, "you're going to have to go back someday. This thing we have, can't last forever." Kanu flicked his ear and yawned. Marco smiled. "Don't pretend you don't understand." That night, a dry wind whispered through the reeds. The campfire had long since burned out. The only sounds were the chirp of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. Until the scream. It was quick, short, sharp, and wrong. Marco sat up in his cot instantly, grabbed his flashlight, and slipped out of the tent. Barefoot, he moved toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth, straining his ears. Another rustle, then a growl, not feline, throatier, wetter, lurking just beyond the firelight. A pair of eyes glinted. Marco took a step back. Hyena. Then another shape appeared, then a third. A small pack. One hissed, long and low, teeth flashing under the moonlight. It crept closer. Marco turned to run, and Kanu exploded from the shadows with a roar. It wasn't the roar of a cub anymore. It was deep, sharp, loud enough to freeze the night air. He tore between Marco and the hyenas. Muscles coiled. Mane flared, voice still echoing. The hyenas shrieked, scattering into the dark like rats. One slipped and slammed into a bush. Another yelped and vanished behind a tree. Kanu didn't chase them. He didn't need to. He turned, circled Marco once, and rubbed his head against the back of his leg. Not in fear. Not in panic, in reassurance. A question. "You okay?" Marco knelt slowly and wrapped his arms around Kanu's neck. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Kanu." That night, Marco couldn't sleep. Not because of fear. Because he realized what had happened. The lion had protected the man. A cub who should have died weeks ago had risked his life for the one who saved him. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't training. It was loyalty, family. It was love. And that made the next decision all the harder. Kanu couldn't stay. He was growing too fast. growing too wild. He needed space, territory, and most of all, his kind. Marco had seen the way Kanu stared at the horizon, especially when lions roared in the distance. There was longing there, instinct. Keeping him would be selfish, dangerous, even, but letting him go, that was a different kind of pain. A few days later, Marco contacted the Okavango Wildlife Authority. He requested assistance tracking nearby prides for potential reintroduction. It would take time, drones, scent trails, observations, but it was possible. He spent every remaining day with Kanu, walking along the banks, sharing meals, letting the silence say what words couldn't. On their last night at the river camp, Marco made a small fire, brewed tea, and sat beside his now nearly full-grown companion. Kanu didn't lie next to him this time. Instead, he sat upright, staring out at the night, listening, waiting. "I think you know, don't you?" Marco said. Kanu flicked his tail but didn't turn. "You're ready." He looked at the lion, his lion, and felt something tighten in his chest. "I'll miss you, Filio mio," he said softly, "my son." Kanu finally turned, and for just a moment, pressed his head into Marco's chest, firmly, deliberately. Then he stepped away into the dark. Not vanishing, not yet, just starting. By morning, the camp was packed. The transfer would happen soon. A team would arrive to help guide Kanu toward a tracked pride, one spotted a few kilometers west. As the sun rose, Marco watched Kanu standing at the edge of the clearing, eyes on the wild. And when the time came, Kanu didn't look back, because he knew the truth. This wasn't goodbye. It was what love looked like when it set something free. The sun hung low in the Botswana sky, casting long shadows over the cracked plains of the Okavango. Marco Leone crouched beside a weathered GPS tracker, sweat clinging to the back of his neck. The screen flickered slightly, the signal faint but clear. The pride had moved again, southwest, toward the deeper channels of the delta. He exhaled slowly. "That's them," he murmured. "They're still moving." Behind him, Kanu sat calmly, tail flicking, nearly full-grown now. The young lion had traded his soft cub features for defined muscle, a thickening mane, and the poise of a wild predator. But he still followed Marco's lead. And he still watched him with the same eyes, sharp, loyal, and quietly searching. Marco packed the GPS into his satchel and glanced ahead. The route would take them across open grasslands, through tangled brush, and, most challenging of all, across the Tholama River. That river was a known barrier. Strong currents, steep banks, crocodiles. But it was the only way. "Ready?" Marco asked. Kanu rose, silent as ever. His answer was in his posture, forward, focused, unafraid. The journey began at dawn. For hours, they moved together, man and lion, through the dust and heat, navigating dry wadis and elephant paths. Marco walked lightly, scanning the terrain. Kanu trotted behind or alongside, sometimes pausing to sniff or crouch in instinctive stalk mode when a lizard darted by. By late afternoon, they reached the high banks of the Tholama. The river roared below, wide, fast, and furious. It churned with muddy energy, swollen from upstream rains. A fallen tree stretched partway across, but not enough to bridge the gap. There were no visible crossings, no makeshift fords, just steep drop-offs and the thundering pulse of moving water. Marco crouched at the edge and studied it. "We'll never find another way in time." He looked at Kanu. Kanu stared at the river, ears back slightly, reading it in his own way. "If we wait too long," Marco said, "we lose the trail." There was no path but forward. He pulled off his boots, secured his backpack over his head, and tied a rope around his waist. Then, taking a deep breath, he knelt beside Kanu and gently placed one arm beneath the lion's chest. "Okay," he said, "just trust me." Kanu didn't resist. Marco slid him up onto his back, arms wrapping under the lion's front legs, chest pressed against Marco's shoulders. The lion's weight was immense, but Marco was wiry and strong, and driven. He stepped into the water. The current grabbed at his legs instantly. Cold and angry, he gasped but moved forward. Each step calculated, careful. The bottom shifted under his feet. Pebbles rolled. Debris floated past. The river pressed harder with every step. Kanu stayed still, tense but calm, clinging with his claws retracted. Breath warm against Marco's neck. Halfway across, the current surged. Marco stumbled. Water swallowed his chest. For one terrifying second, the world tilted, sky, river, lion, and Marco nearly lost his footing. But Kanu growled softly, not in fear, but encouragement. Marco screamed into the roar and pushed forward. Step by grueling step, his muscles burned, his vision narrowed. And then, the bank. He slammed into it with everything he had left. Clawing at roots, digging into the mud. With a final lurch, he threw his upper body forward, collapsed into the reeds, and rolled with Kanu tumbling beside him. They lay there for a moment, soaked, heaving. Then Kanu stood, shook himself off, and turned his head slowly. On the ridge above them stood 6 lions. One male, huge, majestic, his mane dark and full, his eyes locked onto them. 5 lionesses flanked him, tense, their bodies low in the grass. Watching, Marco froze. Kanu didn't. He stepped forward, one paw at a time. Slowly, deliberately. Then he stopped and sat. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the largest lioness, a tawny female with a scar over her right eye, rose. She walked down the ridge, never breaking eye contact. She circled Kanu once, then sniffed his flank. Then she licked his face. A low, harmonic rumble passed through the group. The male stepped forward, let out a short grunt, and turned away. Acceptance. One by one, the other lionesses approached, brushing against Kanu, weaving around him. The pride had recognized him. Kanu had come home. Marco stood at the edge of the tree line, heart still racing. He watched as Kanu melted back into the group, his golden coat disappearing into the shifting mass of lions. One of the cubs, a small, spry female, leaped onto his back and nipped playfully. Kanu responded with a mock growl and flopped into the grass, letting the cub pin him. A lion now among lions. Marco felt something tighten in his throat. He sat down on a flat stone near the river, boots still soaked, pants caked in mud, and let the moment settle. This was what he had wanted. What he had feared. To see Kanu returned, not just to the wild, but to the ones who made him. He knew he couldn't follow. He'd already gone further than any scientist was supposed to. He'd crossed the line between observer and guardian, between guardian and father, but he had no regrets. The next morning, before sunrise, Marco returned to the spot near the river to check one last time. Kanu was there, alone, waiting. When Marco stepped forward, Kanu walked up to him, not urgently, not like before, but calmly, quietly, with a strange dignity. He didn't lean his head against Marco this time. Instead, he touched his forehead gently to Marco's chest and stood there for a long moment. Then he turned, and without a sound, disappeared into the tall grass. The sun rose, golden and wide, spilling across the plains. Marco smiled. He opened his journal and wrote one sentence. The wild gave him back to me, and I gave him back to the wild. And for the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. The wind blew gently across the Okavango, brushing tall grass and rustling the thorny acacia branches as the sun edged closer to the horizon. Marco stood motionless on the riverbank, soaked to the bone, boots heavy with mud, chest heaving from the effort of the crossing. The roar of the tholama behind him had faded into background noise. All his focus, all his breath, was now on the 6 lions ahead of him. The pride. They had gathered at the top of the ridge, 6 statues of muscle and instinct. All eyes fixed on him and the lions standing beside him. Kanu. Marco could feel the heat of the young lion at his side. His breath calm but sharp. His body coiled not in fear but in alertness. He could sense that Kanu recognized them. Something in his posture shifted, his head slightly lower, his tail tucked but still swaying. The pride was watching, waiting. The large male at the center stepped forward slightly. His mane was thick and ragged with age and experience. His frame towering. He didn't roar, not yet, but the air around him seemed to grow heavier. A low growl rumbled from one of the lionesses. Kanu tensed. Marco swallowed hard, then did the only thing he could. The only thing he had come here to do. He stepped back. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised both hands in front of him. Palms out. No aggression, no claim, no fear. His chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths. Then, he let his arms fall to his sides and stood still. Kanu, he whispered, without turning, go. The lion didn't move at first. Marco didn't speak again. After a few seconds, Kanu took a single step forward. Then another. His paws sank slightly into the wet earth as he climbed the incline. Heading toward the pride. The male lion growled again, deeper this time. The lionesses fanned out slightly, their muscles tight, heads lowered. Marco didn't breathe. Kanu continued up the hill. Slow, submissive, but steady. He was halfway up when the largest of the lionesses, the one with a scar above her right eye, broke from the line. She moved down toward him, cautious but purposeful, shoulders rolling with each step. Her eyes never left Kanu. He stopped a few feet from her. Then he crouched, slightly, gently, and lowered his head. The lioness approached. She leaned in, and then, she inhaled, long, deep, nose to fur. Marco's fingers tightened at his sides. Then she licked Kanu's face. Once, twice, and everything changed. The tension snapped like a brittle twig. The low growls ceased. The lionesses behind her began to shift, to soften, tails flicking with what could only be described as recognition. Kanu stood tall again, blinking at the lioness. She rubbed her head against his once and turned. He followed. The male lion let out one low, commanding growl. It wasn't rage. It wasn't a challenge. It was judgment. A test. Marco's heart pounded. The big lion walked forward now. Slowly, each step radiating authority. He stopped 2 feet from Kanu. Their eyes locked. And then the male did something Marco didn't expect. He gave a short grunt, low, almost like a sigh, and turned his back. Accepted. Kanu was home. Marco felt his knees weaken. He didn't fall, but it was close. He stared up at the pride, now moving around Kanu, greeting him, circling him with tails and rumbling growls of welcome. A cub, barely more than a few months old, darted toward Kanu, pawed at his leg, and rolled over. Kanu lowered himself and nuzzled the cub softly. Marco felt a tear roll down his cheek. Then another. And another. He wiped at them with the back of his hand. But they kept coming. He had prepared for this moment. Told himself he would be strong. That this was the goal all along. That love, true love for a wild creature, meant knowing when to let go. But nothing had prepared him for the pain. Kanu was no longer his. Not in the way he had been. He wasn't the injured cub Marco had carried through the desert, or the adolescent who slept by his side in the tent, or the protector who had saved him from hyenas. That Kanu had grown into something bigger, wilder. Right. Marco let out a shaky breath and forced himself to smile. That's your family, he whispered. That's your world now. Kanu turned once, just briefly. His golden eyes met Marco's. Calm, clear, not confused, not lost, thankful. Then he turned back and vanished into the pride. As the sun began to set behind the trees, Marco remained where he was. Alone on the ridge. He sat down slowly, hands resting on his knees. The tears finally drying. He thought of the first time he'd seen Kanu, small, broken, abandoned. He thought of the nights spent nursing him, the whispered conversations, the warmth of his breath as he curled near the fire. He thought of the moment, just days ago, when Kanu pressed his forehead into Marco's chest as if to say goodbye. And thank you, and I know, now, he would be part of the plains again. Of nature, of the balance Marco had dedicated his life to studying. And Marco would return to camp alone. But in the emptiness, there was pride, the kind that came from doing something hard, something true. He stood, wiped the last tear from his cheek, and looked once more across the plains. The pride had disappeared into the grass. But Kanu's roar would live there now. And Marco would carry the echo of it, always. He walked back toward the riverbank, leaving behind a piece of himself. Not in grief, but in gratitude. The sun rose slowly over the Okavango, spilling golden light across the reeds and floodplains. Birds broke the silence with their early songs, and insects buzzed softly in the warming air. The rains had come and gone. Life had returned to the land. And with it, the pulse of the wild. Marco Leone stood at the edge of the river, his boots sinking slightly into the wet mud. He held a water quality sensor in one hand and a small notebook in the other, logging salinity levels and noting the flow rate. This had once been one of the driest spots in the delta, but now the river moved with strength, carving its way through the land again. He hadn't been back here in months. Not since that day, the day he let Kanu go. He had avoided this stretch of land ever since, not out of regret, but because some places hold too much emotion to visit lightly. Still, when the Foundation requested fresh data on the western channels, Marco had volunteered. Some part of him, quiet and stubborn, wanted to see this place again. To stand once more where he had watched Kanu disappear into the tall grass with his pride. He finished logging the readings and slipped the notebook into his vest. He was just about to turn away when he heard something, faint. Steady footsteps. Not a bird, not a human, heavy, padded. He turned, heart pausing mid-beat. There, emerging from the distant tree line, came a lion, broad-shouldered, strong, his mane now fuller and darker, taller, more regal, a silhouette of quiet dominance. Kanu. Marco froze. The lion walked toward him, unhurried. Behind him, half shielded by the grass, came 5 others, lionesses, and 2 nearly grown cubs. The pride. But none approached with aggression. They stopped short, keeping their distance, eyes watchful but calm. Only Kanu continued forward. He made no sound, no roar, no growl. He just came. Marco took a breath, willing himself to remain still, to not speak, to not reach out and disrupt whatever sacred thing was unfolding. When Kanu reached him, he didn't sniff or circle or test the air. He simply leaned in and placed his head gently against Marco's chest. The contact was warm, solid, familiar. His mane brushed Marco's jaw. And for a few precious seconds, the world stopped. There was no fear, no line between man and beast. Just a reunion, quiet, powerful, understood only by the two who had once crossed a river together. Both nearly broken, both refusing to give up. Marco closed his eyes, one hand rising instinctively to rest on Kanu's neck. "You remember," he whispered, and Kanu stayed, just for a moment. Then, as gently as he had arrived, Kanu stepped back. He turned, tail swaying once, and returned to the pride. They vanished into the grass. Marco didn't follow. He didn't need to. Behind him, a drone operator from the conservation team had captured everything. No one had noticed the camera until later. when reviewing footage back at the lodge. Within days, the clip had made its way online. A single minute of video, a man standing by a river. A lion approaching without fear. A silent reunion. A bowed head resting on a human's chest. No audio, no music, just the raw beauty of the moment. It spread like wildfire. Millions viewed it. Conservation pages called it, "the lion who never forgot." Wildlife groups named Kanu an ambassador of coexistence. Schools used it in lessons about compassion and respect for nature. Documentaries requested interviews. Even skeptics found themselves silent, moved by the authenticity of the encounter. But Marco, he kept the memory for himself. He returned to his research. Quietly, traveling across reserves and contributing to protection initiatives. He never chased the attention. He didn't need a platform. He already had his reward. A lion had remembered him. And for one silent moment, had chosen to say it. Not with words, but with trust, with love, with a bowed head and a still heart.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.